In this video I am going to show how to replace the lower ball joints on 1999 to 2007 Chevrolet Silverado and GMC Sierra 2500 trucks. Park the truck on a flat surface, set the emergency brake and block the rear wheels for safety. Raise the front of the truck to a suitable height using a hydraulic jack and place jack stands under the chassis for safety. Loosen the wheel cap nuts with a 22mm socket. Next, remove the lug nuts that hold the wheel using an impact tool and a 22mm socket. Remove the nuts holding the front stabilizer bar link using a 14mm socket from the bottom and a 14mm wrench from the top. Once you have removed the nuts, remove the sway bar end link completely. Remove the bolts that attach the front CV axle shaft to the differential using a ratchet or impact tool and a 15mm socket. Rotate the CV axle by hand to access all the bolts. Separate the CV axle from the differential. If necessary, use a pry bar. Remove the nut and washer holding the outer end of the CV axle using an impact gun and a 36mm socket. Remove the front CV axle by pulling it down and back with your hand simultaneously. If necessary, use a punch and hit the outer section inward with a hammer to free it. Release the ABS sensor cable using a flathead screwdriver and pressing outward on the lock that holds it. Next, finish separating the ABS sensor cable by detaching the clips that hold it. Next, disconnect the ABS sensor cable by pressing inward with your hand on the connector lock and pulling in opposite directions simultaneously to release it. Remove the bolt that holds the base of the brake line to the control arm using a ratchet and a 10mm socket. Remove the two bolts securing the caliper bracket using a ratchet or impact tool and a 21mm socket. Hang the brake caliper to the chassis where it is out of the way to prevent it from hanging on the brake line. Remove the brake disc by pulling it out with clean hands to avoid contaminating the braking surface. Remove the nut holding the steering tie rod end using a ratchet and a 21mm socket. Detach the outer tie rod from the steering knuckle by prying it up and hitting the steering knuckle with a copper hammer near where the two parts meet to release it. Preferably, use a tie rod end separator to make it easier and faster. Loosen the nut holding the upper ball joint using a ratchet and an 18mm socket, without removing it completely. Separate the upper ball joint by prying it with a bar and hitting the steering knuckle with a copper hammer near where both parts join so that it is released. Preferably, use a ball joint separator to make it easier and faster. Loosen the nut that secures the lower ball joint using a ratchet and a 24mm socket. Separate the lower ball joint using a ball joint separator tool, and, if necessary, tap the steering knuckle near where they join to make the lower ball joint release more easily. Next, remove the steering knuckle by removing the nuts that hold the upper and lower ball joints in their entirety, starting with the upper ball joint. If necessary, pry down using a pry bar to make it easier to remove the nut. Remove the defective ball joint using a ball joint removal tool positioned in the correct way as shown in the image. Note, it may be necessary to loosen the bolts holding the upper control arm in place to be able to tilt it upward and have enough space to position the ball joint removal tool. Before loosening the nuts and bolts, mark the relationship of the bolt to the control arm with paint so as not to affect the wheel alignment. Install the new ball joint using the ball joint press in the correct way as shown in the image. Next, finish installing the remaining components in the reverse order in which they were removed, ensuring that all the bolts and nuts are torqued to the correct specs listed in your owner's manual. That's how simple it is to replace the front lower ball joints on 1999 to 2007 Chevrolet Silverado and GMC Sierra 2500 trucks.